Part 4. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn. I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 33. Shen Yu looked at Xie who's tall and straight back walking in front, and suddenly an idea flashed in her mind. Your Highness, she stepped a few steps faster and walked side by side with Xie Zhou, in our team returning to Beijing. The word stopped suddenly because Xie Zhou coughed suddenly, and there was a touch of blood on his lips. Xie Zhou raised his hand to wipe the corners of his lips and glanced at her sideways. Are you afraid that I will die on the road? The blood on his lips made his pale face very beautiful, giving him a broken beauty. Shen Yu believed that he could embrace the moon. If he grew like this, the moon would embrace him on its own. Afraid, Shen Yu stared at him and said seriously, I'm afraid no one can make the defeat of Yan Liang Pass known to the world. This was the case in the last life. Everyone thought that it was Shen Zhong'an who was greedy for power and rashly advanced, harming hundreds of thousands of soldiers and the people of Ganzhou. Although she herself didn't believe such rhetoric, she was far away in Shenjing and had no idea what was going on at the border at that time. She could only marry someone in confusion and die in confusion. A frightening smile appeared on the corners of Xie Ting's lips. He slowly approached, his gaze close at hand. Then don't let me die. Before Shen Yu understood the meaning of the sentence, the body suddenly turned towards her. She hurriedly held onto him, and felt Xie Ting's whole body was hot with her tentacles, and she almost fell to the ground under his weight. When she turned around, she saw a pale cheek lying on her shoulder, her eyes were closed tightly, and her breath was hot. Shen Yu sighed. Was this person trying to trick her just now? In order to prevent yourself from abandoning him when he fainted? I'm afraid the person who least wants him to die is herself, because she is still waiting for him to clear away the grievances of the previous life for her father and brother. Fortunately, she has practiced martial arts since she was a child and is much stronger than ordinary women. But after walking in the snow with Xie Zhou on her back for so long, she almost couldn't hold on anymore. Her legs were numb from the cold, and she could only swing by feeling. When she stepped on an uneven spot, she fell to the ground together with Xie Zhou before she could steady herself. Once that energy is removed, it will be difficult to lift it up. She pulled Xie Ting's arm around her shoulders and failed to lift him up after several attempts. Fortunately, it was in the wild, there was nothing else, and there were a lot of vegetation. I cut a few pieces of wood with a knife that was as sharp as iron and mud, and then tore up the hem of his clothes into strips of cloth to make a stretcher, dragging him 1 foot deep and 1 foot shallow. Walking in the snow. She didn't dare to walk along the river, fearing that the assassins would come downstream, so she could only keep walking in one direction. I don't know how long it took, but the sky gradually became brighter. There was a cock crow in the wind. It was a small village with several farmhouses. Shen Yu hid the knife in the stretcher and dragged Xie Zhou to call the door. The owner of the house, an old man, kindly let people in after hearing what happened to them. Of course, Shen Yu didn't tell the truth. She only said that the two brothers encountered a group of bandits on their way to Beijing to find their relatives. In desperation, they jumped into the water to escape. As a result, they were washed downstream and walked all night to get here. The farmhouse has only 3 cabins and a storeroom. The old man arranged the two of them in one of the rooms and found 2 pairs of his own clothes. Shen Yu put Xie Zhou on a simple wooden bed with hay and a thin mattress on top. Xie Ting's clothes had long been evaporated dry by the heat from his body, and then soaked with sweat. Shen Yu grew up in a military camp. She slept in the sweaty and smelly Daitongbu in the camp. The idea that men and women have different opinions is all nonsense when it comes to life and death. Xie Zhou was almost stripped clean by her. When she took off the last layer of underwear, she felt a little resistance. Turning Xie Zhou over, Shen Yu took a breath. It was too dark to see clearly before, but now I realized that the clothes on his back were stuck together with the solidified flesh and blood. A thin layer of muscle is attached to the back, and the muscles are tight and smooth. Only a bloody wound ruined the beauty, and there were some bruises scattered on the back, as if it was caused by hitting a sharp stone in the water. This person can really endure it? Even after being injured like this, how could this person maintain his composure all the way? He only said to her at the last moment, "Then don't let me die." The conditions in the farmhouse were poor and the wounds could only be simply bandaged. Shen Yu slept and woke up in and out. Every time she woke up, she touched Xieting's forehead. She didn't let herself fall asleep until his fever subsided. As dusk fell, Xieting Zhou gradually woke up from his slumber. The evening glow penetrated the crack in the door and hit him right in the face. He opened his eyes and stared at the beams on the roof, his thoughts gradually returning. He pulled the quilt covering his body and was about to get up when he realized something was wrong. As soon as he moved, a soft body pressed up next to him. The quilt slipped off, revealing a gorgeous face with patches of black and white, sleeping soundly next to him. Xieting Zhou froze. This was the first time he slept on the same bed with a man. It's just this man. He lowered his head and took a closer look. This man is actually quite handsome, with eyelashes as thick as crow feathers and delicate facial features, but his skin color. Just as he was thinking about it, the man opened his eyes. Shen Yu was confused when she woke up. As soon as she opened her eyes, she saw Xieting's face close at hand. There was only such a narrow wooden bed in the room. She was really sleepy, so she had to sleep together with him. She blinked and jumped out of bed. Xieting's nose suddenly hurt, and his head hit him. The pain made him wake up. Sorry. Shen Yu looked at Xieting Zhou, who was covering the bridge of his nose with a resentful look on his face, and said regretfully, "Are you feeling better?" Xieting Zhou closed his eyes with a sigh of relief, not wanting to answer her. He finally understood that he and Shijie were in direct conflict with each other. He fell into the water first, and then was stabbed by her after falling into the water. Now the bridge of his nose may not be saved. This is where. Shen Yu got out of bed to pour him water and answered honestly, "A farmer's family, Grandpa took us in." Xieting Zhou said, "We just met and we're already in love." Shen Yu handed him the water and whispered, "That's because I'm trying to please you." Xieting Zhou. No. A dog barked outside the house. Shen Yu ran over and opened the door. Standing at the door, she saw the old man coming back through the glow, carrying 2 wild ducks in his hands. "Grandpa, you are back." The old man smiled when he saw her. "Wake up, Xiao, I shot 2 ducks and I will help your brother recuperate at night." Shen Yu smiled and nodded, "Thank you, Grandpa." I was about to run to help, but then I remembered that there was an ancestor in the house. Looking back, he saw Xieting Zhou looking at him, with the hand holding the bowl on his knees and one hand supporting the bedboard, sitting lazily. The ridiculously simple farmhouse made him feel like he was in a world away from home. "Brother," Xieting Zhou raised his eyebrows. Shen Yu said, "It was a helpless move, otherwise it would be difficult to explain." "I'm fine." Xieting Zhou turned the bowl in his hand and said, "It's just that being my elder brother and younger brother didn't end well, because..." He looked at Shijie, "They are all dead, and those who are not dead are also disabled." Shen Yu had heard some rumors that Prince Balin had not had many heirs. He originally had 4 sons, but when he died, only Xieting Zhou was left alone. It was claimed that it was either an accident or death from illness, but Shen Yu knew that there was probably something wrong with it. Ordinary families have a few acres of land or 3 ounces of store space and still have to fight over their property, let alone a princely family like Xieting Zhou. Take the current Emperor Tongxue as an example. He gave birth to more than a dozen princes, but only 6 or 7 survive today. But this is not Shen Yu's concern. She calmly pointed to the clothes on the bed. You are too tall to wear grandpa's clothes. I dried your inner clothes and the torn places I sewed them for you. You can only sew them first, just a moment. I'm going to help. Shen Yu turned and left. Wait, Xieting Zhou said. Wash your face clean. Shen Yu's body stiffened. Could it be that he discovered her? Subconsciously, I had to explain, I was always called a sissy in the army and didn't look heroic enough, so. If you're not brave enough, just paint your face black. Xieting Zhou looked him up and down, eat more and grow taller. Shen Yu. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 34. Xieting Zhou stopped looking at her and paused when he picked up the clothes. The tears in the clothes were all twisted and the threads were not of the same color, like a centipede crawling on the clothes. No wonder Shijie was a little embarrassed when he said it just now. Xieting Zhou, who was used to being fastidious, couldn't decide whether to wear clothes or to stay cold. After a while, he took a breath and put on his clothes. When I went out, I saw him talking and laughing with the old man. When the old man was cooking, he sat behind the stove and lit the fire. I don't know what he put on his face before. It was so dark, but now it has been washed off. His facial features are still the same as before. His fair complexion makes his face beautiful and a bit heroic. There are 7 or 8 households in the village. It is close to the edge of the village and there is a big tree next to it. Xieting Zhou stood in front of the door. A goshawk flew over the sky, the sunset was in full bloom, and wisps of smoke and glow merged together. Xieting Zhou actually tasted a rare sense of tranquility at this moment. He has been in a high position since he was born. In this life, he is destined not to live an ordinary life like other people. It's time to eat. The old man smiled and waved to him. Xieting Zhou nodded and walked over. He had not eaten for a whole day and a night, and his stomach was so empty that he felt a little uncomfortable with acid reflux. Vegetables are scarce in the snowy winter, so the dinner table is full of pickled vegetables, potatoes, 2 red eggs, and a bowl of hot wild duck soup, which is very rich. Shen Yu was very grateful. When they met by chance, the old man used everything he had to entertain them. Unfortunately, she was penniless now. She thought that the old man would definitely be reluctant to leave home when he got old. After returning, she would send someone to repair the hut for grandpa and give him some silver. This would ensure that he would have no worries in his later years and grandpa would not have to drag his old body with him. Went up to the mountains to hunt. Xieting Zhou's gestures were all dignified, and it seemed that he did not come from an ordinary family. The old man did not dare to talk to him, but he had a very good chat with Shen Yu. The family at the head of the village just gave birth to a big fat boy. I shot a pheasant and sent it to him. They gave him these red eggs. The old man pushed the red eggs in front of the 2 of them. When he went to deliver the things, he didn't say that he had guests at home, so they only gave them 2. Shen Yu refused and said with a smile, "I don't like eggs, Grandpa, you can eat them." The old man placed both eggs in front of Xieting Zhou and said cautiously, "Eat it, it will replenish your body." Xieting Zhou looked at the eggs without saying anything. The red eggs made him fall into a bad memory. Someone suddenly pinched my arm, and I picked up a lump of rice in the bowl with my chopsticks. He turned to look at Shijie beside him and asked him with his eyes why he was kidnapping him. Shijie winked at him. Seeing that he didn't understand, he lowered his voice and said, "Be more easygoing." Xieting Zhou pursed his lips. It was the first time he heard such a request. He turned around and saw the old man holding a bowl. He was distressed and moved the rice he had just dropped into his own bowl. Xieting Zhou was moved. He glanced at the untouched rice in the bowl and put some into the old man's bowl. Seeing this, the old man wanted to refuse, but because of his expression, he didn't dare to move. He held the chopsticks in a hurry. Keep saying enough is enough. How many people are there in my father-in-law's family? Sieting Zhou took the initiative to speak halfway through the meal. The father-in-law said, there used to be several families, including my wife and 2 sons. What about them? After Shen Yu asked, she noticed that Sieting Zhou glanced at her. I'm the only one left now, the father-in-law said, looking at the table. Both sons joined the army and never came back after going to the front line. My daughter-in-law ran away, and my half-year-old grandson was sick and unable to survive. It made my wife sad, and then she went too. Now De Wang is with me. Shen Yu knew what Sieting Zhou's look meant, and she suddenly felt very uncomfortable. Aren't he and my husband the same? All his relatives died on the battlefield and only he was left. She was doing better, and she still had her grandmother who loved her to the core in Hezhu, and her younger sister Shen Yan, who was not close but related by blood, but her father-in-law was really the only one left. Sieting Zhou saw his eyes turning red again. Shen Yu noticed his gaze and suddenly laughed. Grandpa, if you don't dislike me, you will treat me as your grandson from now on. I will come to see you when I have time. The old man waved his hands quickly. I can't do it, I can't do it. You look like a noble person at first glance. How can you recognize an old man like me as your grandfather? If I say it out and make people laugh, I can't do it. I have never met my grandpa, Shen Yu said. I will kiss you when I see you. I have called you grandpa so many times, and you can't deny it. Shen Yu's grandfather also died on the battlefield. Shen Zhong'an was not married at that time, so he went to the battlefield with a knife. How could any high-ranking man be willing to marry his daughter to a general who had been guarding the border all year round? Besides, Shen Zhong'an had not yet become famous at that time. But one time when he was returning to Beijing to report on his work, he met the legitimate daughter of the Lu family in Hezhu, and the two went to Beijing together, and that was how they became Shen Zhao and Shen Yu. After dinner, it was already dark. The old man had rested early. Sieting Zhou and Shen Yu had slept all day and were not sleepy at all. It was very cold at night, and walking under the moonlight was something no one wanted to do, so the two of them could only stay in the house. There was little furniture in the room, just a wooden bed and a small table. Shen Yu lay on the table and said, "This is far from the county seat. I heard from Grandpa that there is a medical clinic in a town not far away. I will go get some medicine and come back tomorrow to find out more information. Your Highness will stay here. Rest." Although the wound on Sieting Zhou's back was simply bandaged and some herbs prepared by his father-in-law were applied, the effect was not good. His wound is actually very painful now, but there is no trace of discomfort on his face. "You call me your Highness now? Didn't I call you directly before?" Shen Yuxun glanced at him. At this critical moment, the title is not important, right? The more she talked, the more uncertain she became. Sometimes she saw Sieting Zhou as being tolerant and generous, and sometimes he seemed to retaliate. It all depended on his mood. Sieting Zhou fiddled with the tea bowl and asked, "Do you have any money to go to town?" Shen Yu looked at the jade pendant on his waist and then at the ring on his hand, as if she was considering which one to take first. "If you don't want to die too soon, it's best not to think about these things," Sieting Zhou reminded. Shen Yu buried her head in her arms and sighed secretly, "Stingy." Sieting Zhou heard clearly. He didn't want to explain at first, but somehow he changed his mind. If these things are discovered, someone will follow the traces and find them. How can you be sure that you are looking for one of your own and not an assassin? Oh, Shen Yu thought about it for a while. Sieting Zhou's extraordinary items were too eye-catching when taken out, but she didn't have anything special on her, and the previous package had been lost a long time ago. She thought for a moment, then I have another way. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 35. Xieting Zhou slept late last night and it was already bright when he woke up. The sun is shining brightly today, and the snow is so white that it shines brightly. Xieting Zhou didn't see Shijie. The old man was sitting under the eaves playing with rhubarb. He threw a bamboo ball and rhubarb picked it back up. As soon as the old man saw Xieting Zhou, he stood up with his legs and said with a smile, "There is still hot rice in the pot, I will bring it to you." "No need to bother, just wait until lunch and eat together," Xieting Zhou said. The old man had already turned his back and walked towards the kitchen, while mumbling, "If you want it, you must eat well. When you were young." The old man suddenly stopped talking, realizing that he was nagging him as if he were his own child. Xieting Zhou looked more relaxed than yesterday. He was a slow-tempered person. "It's okay, just tell me." The father-in-law said, "If you don't pay attention when you are young, you will suffer from illness when you get old." Xieting Zhou nodded. In fact, he had been suffering from pain for many years. The pain had almost become a part of his body and he had long been used to it. He looked outside. "Where are the others?" The father-in-law knew who he was asking and said, "You said Xiao, he went out as soon as the sky cleared, saying he had something to do in the town." "Oh, that's right," the old man slapped his head, "look at my memory, he told me to tell you, he will definitely come back before dark." As the sun rose and set, the sun jumped over the mountains and the sky gradually darkened. "Shijie hasn't come back yet." The father-in-law was worried and said he wanted to look for Shijie along the road. He was worried that Shijie would get lost and that something would happen to him alone on the road, so Xieting Zhou persuaded him to go to bed. The moon was high in the sky, and Dawang pricked up his ears in the firewood pile. After listening for a while, he ran towards the door of the courtyard. Xieting Zhou heard the sound. He opened the door and saw a thin figure walking in the moonlight. The moon cast a small shadow under his feet. Dawang had already run over excitedly, wagging his tail, rubbing Shijie's legs and walking alongside him. "Why aren't you asleep yet?" Xiu asked Dawang, "Are you waiting for me?" Dawang wagged his tail excitedly, and Sayazi circled around him. A smile appeared on Xieting Zhou's lips. It looked like what he said was true. Not only was he lovable, but even dogs liked him. Unlike Xieting Zhou, Dawang would put his tail between his legs and dare not move every time he saw him. In some aspects, dogs are much more sensitive than people. He is indeed not a good person. Shen Yu walked to the entrance of the courtyard and found someone standing under the eaves. She asked in surprise, "Why didn't you sleep?" "Why so late?" Xieting Zhou asked, returning to the room and lighting the oil lamp. "There are a lot of things, so I'm a little late." Shen Yu put the bundle on the table and spread it out. "In addition to wound medicine and herbs, there is also a set of clothes." Shen Yu said, "The material of this dress is rough, so I can only make do with it first." The graceful and luxurious look on Xieting Zhou's body was too eye-catching. After all, he was in a village and there were many families who could easily be exposed. Xieting Zhou took it and accidentally touched his fingertips, and his tentacles were cold. "Where did you get the money?" Shen Yu was slightly proud. "I told you I had a way, but it wasn't stolen anyway." Xieting Zhou glanced at him and said, "My father-in-law left some rice in the pot for you." Shen Yu was hungry, so she hurried to the kitchen, not forgetting to say, "Wait until I come back to give you medicine." When Xieting Zhou heard this, he put down the medicine he picked up. When Shen Yu came in after eating, Xieting Zhou was still sitting at the table. She closed the door and walked over to give him medicine, first on his back and then on his arms. There was no stove in the room, and a gust of wind came through the crack in the door. Shen Yu looked at the goosebumps on Xieting Zhou's arms and said hurriedly, "Soon, it will be fine soon." Xieting Zhou lowered his eyes, saw his eyelashes moving slightly, and then looked away calmly. The room was too quiet, so Shen Yu looked for a topic. Do you think I ran away secretly when I came back so late? Or maybe I surrendered to the enemy and tipped them off. In fact, such thoughts did flash through Xie Ting's mind just now. But that's just a habit. His position means that he cannot trust anyone easily, because too many people want his life. But for Shijie. He thought for a moment and then looked down at Shijie's face. There seemed to be an inexplicable trace of trust, but his body's instinct was rejecting this trust. Shen Yu didn't hear his answer. While applying the medicine, she explained to herself, it was already afternoon when I arrived in the town. After shopping, I went to find out some news, so I came back so late. What news? Xie Tingzhou asked. Shen Yu said, some people who came back from Huaitang County said that the Huaitang County magistrate is now looking for someone in a big way. I heard that the description should be that he is looking for His Highness. We can go to the county seat tomorrow and then the Huaitang County magistrate will send someone escort to Beijing. Xie Tingzhou was silent, thinking for a while, and then said, I can't go. Why? Shen Yu just finished bandaging and raised her head to ask. Xie Tingzhou said, the number of people who came to silence us this time is at least 300. Huaitang is not a big city. It is impossible for the county magistrate to not know about such a large number of people passing through the county. Shen Yu was awakened by him, so you suspect that magistrate Huaitang is from the other party. Xie Tingzhou looked down at his arm. It was no longer the rag strips he had torn off before. This time it was replaced by gauze, which was bandaged very well. The bandits are rampant in Huaitang County. The government has come out to encircle and suppress them several times, but they have not been completely wiped out. Why? He paused and continued, every time we carry out sieges, we arrest a few bandits symbolically, which cannot shake the foundation. The bandits and the county government share the spoils, and the county government turns a blind eye. Such people only have interests can push. Shen Yu nodded, then what should we do? Xie Tingzhou looked at the moonlight falling in from the window, pondered for a moment and said, let's set off after 2 days of rest, and take a detour to Pingtan. Shen Yu thought for a while, it takes a detour of hundreds of miles from Pingtan County. Now there is no means of transportation. Can your body bear it? Your wounds. When the dressing was changed just now, the wound looked scary. I really don't know how he endured it. It's okay, Xie Tingzhou stood up and said, go to sleep. Xie Tingzhou was already awake. Shen Yu still remembered that he was the Prince of Balan and did not dare to ask him if I could sleep with you when he was awake. Naturally, Xie Tingzhou would not take the initiative to invite you to sleep with me, so Shen Yu spent the whole night lying on the table. During the day, Xie Tingzhou had a few words with his father-in-law, who found a wooden board to make the bed wider. Shen Yu understood as soon as she saw the bed, should I sleep with you tonight? Xie Tingzhou stopped taking off his clothes, turned his head and said, if you want to continue sleeping on the table, you can. Shen Yu had been tired for a day, so of course she wouldn't have trouble with herself, so she slipped out to wash up. When she walked in, Xie Tingzhou was already lying on the outside of the bed. There was still a lot of space inside, but the problem was that if she wanted to get into bed, she had to step over Xie Tingzhou. Shen Yu hesitated for a moment and blew out the oil lamp. The light suddenly dimmed, and she had not yet adapted to the darkness in front of her, so she could only lightly touch the bed. Guessing that she should be at the edge of the bed, she stretched out her hands, trying to get over Xie Tingzhou and support herself on the bed board. As soon as she put her hand down, she thought to herself, it's over. Sure enough, the next moment, Xie Tingzhou groaned and asked coldly, what are you doing? Then Shen Yu's hand was pulled away by him. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 36. I went to bed, it was too dark to see, Shen Yu explained stammeringly. Because just now she felt herself pressing on Xie Ting's body, but she didn't know where exactly. There was a rustling sound in the darkness. Xie Tingzhou stood up from the bed and said in a cold voice, "Go in." Shen Yu hurriedly climbed onto the bed and lay down with her clothes on. She recalled the feeling just now in her mind. The more she thought about it, the more she felt something was wrong. Although her feeling was a little blurry through the quilt, she was sure that what she pressed before was not Xie Ting's chest. Where could that be? She didn't sleep well last night, and now she couldn't suppress her sleepiness and fatigue. Shen Yu fell asleep after thinking about it. Xie Tingzhou was woken up by the loud voice of the woman outside. He didn't know why, but he slept very well these past 2 nights. He hadn't had such a solid sleep in a long time. Shen Yu was sitting at the table with her back to the bed. She put one arm on the table and was doing something unknown. From time to time, she could hear a gentle intake of breath. "What are you doing?" Xie Tingzhou stood up and asked. Shen Yu suddenly turned around and looked at him like a frightened deer. Her eyes were watery, like a clear spring filled with water, and she had a fragile look. Xie Ting's heart suddenly trembled inexplicably. Before he had time to explore what that strange feeling was, Shijie had already turned his head quickly. Xie Tingzhou put on his robe and walked over, finally seeing what she was doing. Several wounds were spread ferociously on his arms. Judging from the wounds, they should have been caused by wild beasts. "Did you encounter a wild beast on the road yesterday?" Xie Tingzhou asked. The powder was sprinkled on the wound, and Shen Yu was in so much pain that she couldn't speak. In the past, she moaned in pain when she was injured, and she could act coquettishly with her father and brother. After her father and brother left in her previous life, she learned to grit her teeth and endure it no matter how hard it was. After waiting for a while, Shen Yu said, "It's a leopard. I wouldn't have been injured originally, but I squatted on it for too long, and the cold weather made my reaction a little slower, but I finally killed it." "You went hunting?" Shen Yu was so painful that she blew gently on the wound several times. "I asked Grandpa yesterday that there are ferocious beasts on the mountain. I was lucky today. The leopard skin is valuable, otherwise I wouldn't be able to exchange it for so much money." Xie Tingzhou looked at the clothes on his body and didn't know how he felt. His lips were slightly parted, and just as he was about to speak, he heard the woman outside the door suddenly ask a question while chatting. "Uncle Zheng, I heard from the Zhaoshan family that there are guests at your house." The two stopped moving at the same time and looked at each other in understanding. Shen Yu had already ducked over and took out the knife hidden under the bed board. Xie Tingzhou held his shoulders, shook his head at him, looked sideways at the door, and heard the father-in-law outside say, "It's a distant relative of mine who came over to visit me during the Chinese New Year." They both breathed a sigh of relief at the same time. Xie Tingzhou glanced at the knife in Shijie's hand and said quietly, "Did you just want to silence me?" "How is that possible?" Shen Yu looked at him inexplicably. "I'm planning to run away." "Then what are you doing with the knife?" Shen Yu touched the knife lovingly. "It would be a pity to lose such a good knife. I'm almost drowning in the water and I don't want to throw it away, let alone leave it here." Outside the house, the woman was holding a handful of pumpkin seeds, cracking them, and peering inside. "You call me out and identify yourself. Zhao Shun's family passed by your house yesterday and went back to read it for a day. She said that a relative of yours was so handsome. She had never seen anyone so handsome in her life. He was so handsome at that time. I can't even walk." Uncle Zheng declined with a smile. "They are living in poverty, and they haven't gotten up yet." The woman leaned on the bamboo frame and said, "I'm just curious about what it looks like to make people unable to walk. The Zhao Shun family said it looks like the Bodhisattva in that temple." Shen Yu thought of the square-headed and broad-eared appearance of the Bodhisattva in the temple, and then looked at Xie Ting's handsome face, but she really couldn't connect the two. Xietingzhou noticed that Shi Yu wanted to smile, so he gave him a warning look, lifted up his clothes and sat down next to him. Hand. Shen Yu saw that he wanted to bandage her wound, so she didn't refuse. She put her arm on the table and handed him the gauze. The bones in his hands were clear and the fingers were long and slender, as if they had been carefully carved. He worked slowly, and the gauze in his hands seemed to be no longer gauze, but turned into high-quality gauze worth 100 gold. The coarse linen clothes couldn't cover up the noble aura on his body. Shen Yu looked at it and couldn't help but sigh in her heart. The ones raised by the prince's family were different. 2 words, rich. Looking at herself again, she was raised with pearls and jade by the richest family of the Lu family in Hezhu, but now she looks like a beggar. After the bandaging was completed, the chat outside had not ended yet. The woman seemed not to be ready to leave and kept talking. Is your nephew married? How many people are there in the family? How many acres of land are there? Uncle Zheng was annoyed by her questions, but he still dealt with it patiently. The people outside didn't leave. Shen Yu was scratching her skin and itching, restless, and walked around the small room. Xietingzhou got annoyed and looked up at him. What are you doing? Shen Yu said with difficulty, I want to go to the toilet. Xietingzhou said, go ahead. I can bear it any longer. Shen Yu pursed her lips and said, if you go out, you will definitely be seen by the woman, which will undoubtedly increase the possibility of exposure. Xietingzhou stopped talking. After a while, he looked at Shi Yu's face that was almost deformed from holding back, and said jokingly, can you still bear it? Shen Yu didn't dare to speak. She was afraid that she would be discouraged as soon as she opened her mouth. She could only shake her head seriously. Xietingzhou chuckled, hurry up and go. Shen Yu opened the door and ran away as if she had received an amnesty. The woman was trying her best to persuade Uncle Zheng to call her nephew out to see him. She also wanted to see what the living bodhisattva looked like. Uncle Zheng, you are too stingy. Look, you won't lose 2 tails, eh? The woman stood up straight, pointed at Shen Yu who rushed out of the room and said, is that your nephew? Ouch, he is really good looking, like a bodhisattva. Thank you. Shen Yu was anxious and had no time to speak, so she hurriedly ran to the hut behind the house. The woman looked excited. No one was around, but she was still looking around. Has your nephew got a wife? After saying that, he shook his head and said, no, she is more beautiful than my Xiu Niang, or... The woman suddenly opened her mouth wide and stared dumbly at the person who came out of the room. The pumpkin seeds in her hand fell to the ground. This. The woman couldn't speak clearly. This must be a god. Xietingzhou stood at the door, his sharp and cold gaze swept over, and the woman immediately felt her legs and feet went weak. When Shen Yu came back from going to the toilet, she saw a woman in her 40s standing blankly holding onto the fence and looking in the direction of Xietingzhou, with a blush gradually appearing on her face. Very good, Shen Yu thought to herself, she is attracted to Xietingzhou. She is probably older than Xietingzhou's mother, Princess Balin. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 37. Xietingzhou's expression was calm and he calmly withdrew his gaze and left. Shen Yu couldn't help but was speechless. Mr. Lanyu is not famous in vain. He is just an admirer, and it is just a small scene. But Shen Yu obviously thought wrong. Before lunch was finished, there was a noise outside the courtyard. Uncle Zheng put down his chopsticks and went out to take a look. He saw a group of women walking to the door chattering. The leader was the daughter-in-law of Zhao Shun's family, and she opened the half-height low door of the fence courtyard. People come in uninvited, and it's too late to stop them. Uncle Zheng was so angry that he stamped his feet, turned to look at Xietingzhou and Shen Yu, and said nervously, This, this, this. Uncle Zheng lives alone on weekdays, and rarely has anyone visit him. He has never dealt with so many women in his life, and he couldn't even speak clearly for a while. Hey, Uncle Zheng, are you still eating? Zhao Shun's wife walked in front and spoke first. Yes, we are eating. Uncle Zheng just hoped that they would leave soon. Are you busy? Zhao Shun's wife pressed the pink flower on her temple and said, I just want to drop by and see you. Zhao Shun's wife's eyes were stunned. Her eyes were already fixed on Xie Tingzhu's face. When she saw Shen Yu next to her, her eyes lit up again. She only saw Xie Tingzhu when she came yesterday. She didn't expect that Uncle Zheng's life would be so good. Without his son, he would have 2 more handsome nephews. This village is remote and you haven't seen a stranger for a year and a half, so it's natural that there are 2 handsome men. Some simply came to watch the excitement, while others were dressed up and had their New Year jackets turned out. Even Mrs. Lu from the end of the village followed behind with a cane. This is how it is in the village. If there is any disturbance, it will be spread to everyone in just one meal. Uncle Zheng blocked the door and refused to let in. A group of women poked their heads in and looked inside. The rules in Balan Palace are very strict. No one would dare to stare at Xie Tingzhu while he was eating. The maids and servants must lower their heads when entering and exiting, and they must not look around, let alone stare at him while eating. Xie Tingzhu put down his chopsticks and stood up. To go back to the room, you need to go out of the main room and turn right, but the door is blocked. It was the master's turn to clear the road, so it was naturally her job as a guard. Shen Yu hurriedly scraped off the rice in the bowl, rushed in front of him, and greeted everyone at the door. Excuse me, please give way, my brother is going back to rest. It's still early, someone in the crowd said, let's sit down and have a rest. Where did the young master come from? The door was so blocked that no wind could get in. Shen Yu couldn't take action, let alone let the Prince of Balan act like a monkey here. They are all neighbors. From now on, when the uncle lives here, he will have to rely on the villagers to take care of him. Let's wait for another day. Another day. Shen Yu could hardly bear to be patient, so she coaxed the person away first and then said, let's prepare fruits for another day. Let's sit down and talk. Uncle Zheng said angrily, that's right, you blocked my door. Those who didn't know better thought you were here to collect debts. The woman who couldn't push to the front yesterday said loudly from behind, that's right, don't let people say that we village women don't understand the rules. Seeing that everyone was a little shaken, Shen Yu added another fuel to the fire. The weather is bad today, and I saw that the tree at the head of the village is nice. Why not put melon and fruit refreshments there in the evening and drink with the sunset? It would be so elegant. Village women don't know anything about elegance, but seeing that both of them are fairy-like figures, they are naturally different from people like them. Everyone opened the door to a wide path for one person, and someone said, let's do it tomorrow, I'll prepare a pot of tea. What kind of good tea can you get at your house? My guy is going to town tomorrow. I'll ask him to bring back some snacks. Everyone has begun to assign tasks and who is responsible for preparing what. Shen Yu looked back at Xie Tingzhu and motioned for him to follow quickly. Someone behind the crowd pushed her. The person in front was pushed and was about to pounce on Shen Yu who was passing by. It wouldn't be a big deal just to throw him down, but it happened to be the injured side. Just as he was about to catch Shen Yu's injured arm, Xie Tingzhu suddenly stretched out his hand to stop him. The woman threw herself on Xie Tingzhu's arm. The joy had not yet spread on her face. When she raised her eyes and saw Xie Tingzhu's face, her face suddenly froze. Xie Tingzhu looked at her slightly and said word by word, stand still. When their eyes met, the woman immediately shuddered. She clearly saw murderous intent in those sharp eyes. Xie Tingzhu and Shen Yu entered the room and closed the door, and Shen Yu let out a long sigh of relief. After she married Zhang Lian, She also walked around with the wives of high-ranking officials and attended several banquets. Every time she went there, it felt like her days were like years. Only now did she realize that there are people outside the world. After hearing the group of women in the courtyard walking away, Shen Yu took the kettle on the table and went out. After a while, he came back with the pot. Shen Yu poured a bowl of tea, held it in both hands and handed it to Xietingzhou. "Your Highness, please have tea." Xietingzhou reached out and took the tea bowl. There is a faint fragrance of tea floating in the air. Although it is not good tea, it is enough. "Where did you get the tea?" Xietingzhou took a sip. The taste was indeed not very good. Shen Yu said, "I bought it in the town yesterday." Xietingzhou took another sip and said, "What are you buying tea for? Do you have a lot of money?" Seeing that his bowl was almost empty, Shen Yu hurriedly added more to him, because His Highness actually frowns slightly every time he drinks water. "I guess he is not used to drinking the water here." Xietingzhou stared at him for a few seconds. His expression seemed to be smiling but not smiling, which made Shen Yu feel uncomfortable. "What are you laughing at, Your Highness?" Shen Yu asked. Xietingzhou shook the tea bowl lightly. The color of the tea soup was dim. This was the worst quality tea he had ever drunk. He smiled lightly and said, "I just blocked someone for you, so I kept calling His Highness one after another. In the past, I would boldly call you you. Just like the rhubarb in the yard, he would wag his tail at anyone who was nice to him, which was a bit cute." Xietingzhou leaned closer. "Are you so easy to bribe?" Shen Yu was stared at by him, her body unconsciously leaned back, and she said confidently, "That's because there are outsiders around, so His Highness's identity cannot be exposed." "Really?" Xietingzhou put down the tea bowl and said, "Then last night when we were alone, who said to me, 'Come here and sleep a little bit'?" Shen Yu was embarrassed. "Yes, yes." She thought about it carefully, and it seemed that there was such a thing. She felt very cold in the middle of the night, so she unconsciously squeezed closer to Xietingzhou, and he stepped back, and then almost fell out of bed. At that time, Xietingzhou sighed in the darkness. She seemed to have said something to ask him to lie down. However, she would never admit it. Could it be that Your Highness was asleep and remembered it wrong? Shen Yu shamelessly refused to admit it. Xietingzhou didn't argue with him and changed the topic. "You can go to the tea party tomorrow by yourself." Only then did Shen Yu remember that there was another big problem. She was so outspoken and spoke so quickly just to persuade people to leave first. Who knew that those women were not easy to fool, so they directly set a date for her. "I'm not going," Shen Yu said. Looking at his wrinkled face, Xietingzhou remained silent. "Is it possible that I go? Let the dignified Prince Balin go have a tea party with a group of women?" Tisk tisk, Shen Yu didn't even dare to think about that scene. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the Concubine, Eliminating the Wife, Reborn, I Refuse to Marry the Scumbag and Marry the Prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 38. Shen Yu cleaned up the snow in the yard, and in the afternoon she accompanied her father-in-law to go hunting in the mountains. One of her hands was injured and she couldn't use her strength, so she didn't get anything good, but her husband was very happy and said that in the past, his son would go hunting with him in the mountains, and he would be happy even if he came back empty-handed. After dinner, Shen Yu played with rhubarb in the yard with a bamboo ball. The shadows of one person and one dog stretched out on the ground. Xietingzhou and his father-in-law were sitting under the eaves chatting. Over the past few days, the two of them have gradually become familiar with each other. Xietingzhou is not as cold as he seems on the outside, and his father-in-law is no longer afraid of him. "Dawang, run." Shen Yu raised her hand and the bamboo ball flew out. De Huang ran away, came back, and threw the ball at Shen Yu's feet. He put his two front legs on Shen Yu's knees and waggled his tail crazily. Shen Yu touched De Huang's head and praised it. Our De Huang is awesome. Hey, they're all here. Several people turned to look and saw a woman standing outside the yard, holding onto the fence with one hand and carrying a basket in the other. When the old man saw it, his face suddenly darkened. He turned his head and said to Xietingzhou, "This is Widow Lu from the village." Hey. My father-in-law is not a person who likes to stir up trouble, and there are some things that are difficult to say. Shen Yu didn't understand. Grandpa, what's wrong with her? Xietingzhou understood. He was a few years older than Shi Yu. He understood it when he heard his father-in-law say hey. The old man had an embarrassed look on his face. He had been facing the earth with his back turned to the sky all his life. He was uneducated and didn't know how to express it tactfully. That's it, I'll tell you later. After hearing half of the words, Shen Yu was scratching her head. Looking at Xietingzhou's understanding expression, she felt even more uncomfortable. I'm afraid she and De Huang are the only ones in this yard who don't understand. Shen Yu sat on the small bench and stared at Xietingzhou in confusion. De Huang rubbed her legs. Seeing that she ignored her, she also sat on the ground and stared at Xietingzhou. A man and a dog sat obediently side by side. This scene made Xietingzhou want to laugh. He calmly moved his eyes away, put his hand into a fist under his nose, coughed slightly, and said, "She has a lot of experience in the communication between men and women." The old man couldn't help but sigh. It is indeed different if he is knowledgeable. Shen Yu was stunned for a few seconds and suddenly realized. As a widow, there is no backbone in the family, so it is easy for others to take advantage of her. Looking at Widow Liu's expression and dress, she does not look like a responsible person. Widow Lu saw that a few people were chatting and not paying attention to her, so she raised her voice and said, "Uncle Lu, I heard that guests came to your home. I thought that you must not have anything to entertain the guests at home, so I made some for you and sent them over." As he spoke, he opened the low door and walked in with his hips swaying. Shen Yu was stunned. This was the first time she saw a person twisting into a water snake. Wouldn't his waist be broken? Widow Lu saw this young man staring at her and gave him a wink. Uncle Zheng simply didn't look at it. He moved his bench and smoked a cigarette against a bare tree in the yard. Widow Lu walked directly to Xietingzhou, opened the basket and revealed a roast chicken inside, and said, "Sir, this is cooked by the slave family themselves." The widow's eyes flashed, as if she wanted to knock Xietingzhou down on the spot. I'm afraid she did it in person, Shen Yu thought, but she didn't say anything to stop her. This woman's charm is still there. Who knows whether Xietingzhou is happy or not? After all, she had heard some rumors. After Xietingzhou left the battlefield, he became a frequent visitor to flower houses in various places in the north, and he was drunk and dreaming all day long. Those officials, rich gentry and gentry, were following his fancy and looking for beauties from all over to honor him. Although he did not accept all of them, he was able to keep a few selectively. It was obvious that he had standards. Xietingzhou stood up and was taller than Widow Lu. He took the roast chicken and said, "Thank you very much." When Widow Lu saw that he had accepted it, she suppressed her joy and said softly, "Master, there is no one at home. It rained a few days ago and the house has some leaks. Master, can you come with me to have a look tonight?" Shen Yu snorted lightly. It was almost dark. If you were repairing a roof at night, you wouldn't be afraid of missing it and falling to your death. Xietingzhou heard the sneer and turned to look at Shizhi. He was silent for a moment, then suddenly said, "I'm sorry, I have been weak since I was a child. I'm afraid I can't do things like climbing a beam to the house." Shen Yu sneered again. She was still weak since she was a child. Xietingzhou must have forgotten the days when he wielded his sword to kill enemies on the battlefield. Widow Lu was anxious and said hurriedly, "You don't have to go to the house, you don't have to go to the house." If there was no one else around, she would just say, "Go to bed." Xieting nodded thoughtfully, "That's it?" He looked at Shijer, "But this younger brother of mine is quite good at getting on beam or anything else." Shen Yu was shot innocently, and the bench under her butt almost tipped over. She just sneered from the bottom of her heart, "No, twice. Is it necessary to retaliate so harshly?" Widow Lu wanted to say something else, but she was afraid of Xieting's aura and did not dare to speak. She could only retreat and look at Shen Yu. "This one is not bad, although not as tall and straight as the other one, and a bit thinner, but this face is still very handsome. Looking at the whole town, you can't find anyone so handsome." Widow Lu made up her mind, turned to look at Shen Yu with a smile on her face, and said in a long voice, "Master." "No," Shen Yu interrupted her unceremoniously and said with a sad look on her face, "To tell you the truth, I have some problems and I am powerless." Xieting choked suddenly, and he didn't know whether he was choked by the wind or by these words. The topic was too sensitive, and my father-in-law had already gone into the house with his pipe. Widow Lu was so shocked that she couldn't close her mouth. She looked at Xieting again, as if asking him for confirmation. Xieting held back his laughter and said, "Then there's nothing we can do. Please go back." Widow Lu took a few steps away, then looked back at the basket in Xieting's hand. "After losing a lot of money, I still thought that I was a widow anyway, and after sleeping with him, I would let the young man know how good I was, and it would not be impossible to marry again. Now I can't steal the chicken, but I have lost one. What a loss." When Widow Lu walked out of the yard, Xieting looked at Shen Yu, "Are you weak-minded?" Shen Yu was silent and silent. It was not his fault. Fortunately, he gave him medicine, tea, and clothes. When the disaster was approaching, he pushed himself out as a shield and let the dogs eat his conscience. His expression was indignant. Xieting looked amused and began to tease him. "You have done a good job in protecting the master. When you come to Beijing, I will find you a male master and give you several concubines." "That's not necessary," Shen Yu gritted her teeth, "why don't you give me something else?" "What?" "That knife." Xieting looked at him with a smile, "Do you like that knife?" Shen Yu nodded quickly. Xieting "Don't even think about it." "Not to me? So what do you ask?" Shen Yu thought to herself that she would have thrown it into the river. Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 39. Xieting handed over the basket in his hand, and Shen Yu opened the cloth on it, and a smell of meat wafted up. She was so greedy that the last time she had roast chicken was a few months ago in Shengjing. As soon as he picked up a chicken leg and prepared to bite it, he saw Xieting looking directly at him. "You want to eat too?" Shen Yu handed it to him. "I'll give it to you first." Xieting didn't answer and said calmly, "You dare to enter anything? How vigilant are you as a guard?" Shen Yu retreated, living a rare and relaxed life these days, always thinking that there would be a tough battle to fight after returning to Beijing. Nowadays, there are not many such relaxed days, and people have become more relaxed. "Can't you eat it?" "Xieting if you are not afraid that she will put medicine in it, then you can take it." "What medicine?" Shen Yu asked, but when she saw Xieting's expression, she immediately understood. As a widow, what medicine can she give? Of course. Shen Yu thought about it but gave up. She was afraid that she would lose control and knock Xieting down after dinner. What should she do? He is so weak now, so naturally he cannot be stronger than himself. If the overlord forces Xietingzhou to sleep, will he turn around and send dozens or hundreds of secret guards to hunt him down? After thinking about it for a long time, Shen Yu came to her senses, but she didn't dare to eat the chicken again. Throw it away then. Xietingzhou pointed his chin, give it something to eat. Shen Yu blurted out, you have a vicious heart, what will you do if you eat rhubarb? This man is getting bolder and bolder, and he even dares to call him evil. Xietingzhou turned around and walked away. After walking a few steps, he turned back and said, his sweetheart is at the end of the village. Shen Yu was surprised, how did you know? My father-in-law said it. Xietingzhou left without looking back, looking a little angry. Shen Yu curled her lips, looking at the chicken that she couldn't eat, and her mouth watered with greed. He looked down at Dawang, who was wagging his tail frequently, and said, okay, if you like me, I'll feed you. Xietingzhou didn't talk to Shen Yu all night. Early the next morning, Rhubarb came back from breakfast wagging its tail and looking very happy. It seemed that there was indeed something wrong with the chicken. Fortunately, he didn't eat it. Otherwise, it would be Xietingzhou who would lose his virginity today, and he would be the one who would lose his life. In the afternoon, my father-in-law went out for a walk, and when he came back he looked solemn. After dinner, it was getting dark. The old man went out for a walk, put down the tea party, came back and sat under the eaves and smoked several rolls of local cigarettes in silence before entering the house. Before dawn, Xietingzhou was woken up by a knock on the door. Xietingzhou opened the door and saw his father-in-law standing at the door, holding a coarse cloth bundle in his hand. The father-in-law walked in by himself, woke up Shijir who was sleeping soundly on the bed, and said, I'll see you off. I'll ask you if you have any questions on the way. Shen Yu suddenly woke up. They didn't bring any luggage, so they packed it up in a moment. There was an ox cart outside the courtyard, and the old man was sitting in the cart. When the two of them got on, he drove the cart and set off. It was windy at night, but fortunately the moonlight covered the ground and I could barely see the road. The old man sighed and said, yesterday I went to the village to check in. The people who came back from the town said that the magistrate of Huaitang County had already found the people in the town, and it was no longer safe here. Xietingzhou and Shen Yu were shocked at the same time. Grandpa, Shen Yu lost her voice, how did you know you were looking for us? The old man smiled with narrowed eyes and patted the seat beside him, Xiao, sit here. Sitting together, the two of them really looked like grandparents. The father-in-law said slowly, you have extraordinary bearing and are not like ordinary people. Besides, how can any ordinary person wear such materials and carry a knife? Shen Yu choked, you all know, aren't you afraid that we are bad people? I know, the old man said with a smile, I found it the day I widened the bed for you. Don't look at the old man, I have bad eyesight, but my heart is bright. You two are good children, especially you. The old man patted Shen Yu on the shoulder and said, to please my old man, I recognize you as my grandson. Sushi was about to leave, and Shen Yu felt a little uncomfortable in her heart. The father-in-law said, go straight from this road to the ferry. After crossing the river, walk 10 miles to reach Guandao. I gave you some cakes in the bag at the back for you to keep for the journey. Old man, I have no money, so I can only give you these. Xietingzhou touched the baggage. It was still hot. It should be the cake made by his father-in-law overnight. He opened it and saw another package under the pancake. Xietingzhou patted Shen Yu in front of her. Shen Yu turned around and he handed over the bundle. Shen Yu couldn't help but shed tears when she saw it. The package under the pancake was a chicken wrapped in vegetable leaves. It had been cooked and was hot and fragrant. It must have been that day when her grandfather saw her wanting to eat chicken. Where did you get the chicken? Shen Yu asked, holding back tears. I borrowed it, The old man said cheerfully, I will raise another brood of chickens in the spring next year. I will return one chicken then and you will keep the rest. Shen Yu's eye sockets were shallow and she couldn't hold back the tears, so she hurriedly turned her face away. I don't know when I will be able to do this again. The wheels crunched in the snow. As if he was afraid that he would not have time to finish his words, the old man muttered to himself, I originally thought that I am the only one left in the family. If I die any day, I can die. The villagers can just bury me next to my wife and son. But it's different now. The father-in-law said in a light voice, now that I have a grandson, I have thoughts about him. It was getting brighter and the ox cart stopped at the ferry. The old man shouted, and the boatman on the other side of the ferry came over with his boat. Shen Yu's eyes were red. She wanted to take her grandfather with her, but the journey was difficult and dangerous, and she might encounter someone who came to assassinate her. She couldn't let her grandfather take the risk. You must take care of your health. I will send someone to pick you up when I go back. I will definitely honor you. The old man touched her head and said, good boy, they are all buried here. I have to guard them here. Then I'll send you a message, Shen Yu said. The old man nodded and said, go. The boatman docked, and Shen Yu and Xieting Zhou walked towards the boat. As soon as I uploaded it, I saw my father-in-law waving his hand and shouting, boatman, wait a minute. The old man was holding a package in his hand. It was the chicken that Shen Yu secretly left on the bullock cart. The old man staggered over, panting and stuffing the chicken into Shen Yu's hands. Grandpa gave it to you, keep it to eat. The ferry swayed away from the shore, the sun gradually rose, and there was a circling goshawk in the sunlight. The old man didn't say anything, he just smiled and waved his hand, and the sunlight that had just peeked out of his head fell on his wrinkled face. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 40. A group of people walked on the official road, with several horses in front and behind, and the people on the horses were carrying weapons such as swords. There were several carriages driving in the middle, one of which was a simple-looking carriage. Immediately, a woman in heroic attire glanced at the sky, rode to the carriage, straightened her appearance first, and then spoke, Master Shi. As soon as she opened her mouth, there was a burst of laughter from behind. Someone imitated her and pinched her throat and said, Master Shi. The woman turned her head and glared, drew her sword and pointed it at the other person as a warning. When she turned around, she changed her face and whispered softly, Master Shi, this is still a long way from the next city. We are going to rest here tonight. We'll be on the road again tomorrow morning. I'll boil some hot water for you two to wash up later. In the car, Shen Yu looked distressed, cleared her throat and said, Miss He, I'm sorry. No trouble, no trouble. After He Sui finished speaking, she ran to the back of the horse, took a whip and whipped the horse hard like hers. Xieting Zhou leaned on the cushions and smiled, listening to the sound of horse hooves walking away, and said slowly, this Miss He is very discerning. Shen Yu silently turned her back to Xieting Zhou. I don't know if He Sui is blind, but he can't see such an amazing and talented person like Xieting Zhou here. On the contrary, he has been courting Shen Yu frequently in the past 2 days. This matter has to start from the day I parted ways with my husband. After crossing the river that day, Xieting Zhou was in poor health and could not walk quickly. They walked more than 10 miles from early morning to noon. However, the two of them were lucky and met an escort team after they got to the official road. The escort took them into Pington County and separated from them. Escorts earn their hard-earned money, and taking them along for a ride is the ultimate act of benevolence. They originally stayed at the worst inn in Pington County that night. After nightfall, Shen Yu quietly went out after Xieting Zhou fell asleep. When they got up in the morning, the escort was already waiting at the door of the inn. They said that they were going to escort the escort to Shengjing and they just happened to give them a ride. But he changed his mind overnight, and looking at his attentive attitude, he didn't even believe Xieting Zhou without paying. But where the money came from is a question. The carriage stopped in the leeward place. It was freezing outside, so the two of them did not get out of the car. Xieting Zhou opened the curtain with 2 fingers and looked outside. Yu Guangxian saw Shi Yu pull 2 sesame seed cakes out of the bag and handed one to him. "Do you want to eat?" As soon as Xieting Zhou let go, the curtain was put back on the window. When Shen Yu saw that he didn't answer, she started eating by herself. Xieting Zhou watched silently, simply lying down and watching him chew the cake. The cake was hard and tasted like chaff. Xieting Zhou waited for him to take the last bite into his mouth, and suddenly said, "If you have so much money, why live such a miserable life?" Ahem. Shen Yu suddenly choked on the dry biscuit and beat her chest hard. Xieting Zhou looked at him for a moment, slapped him on the back suddenly, and finally swallowed the cake. Shen Yu quibbled, "Where did I get the money?" Xieting Zhou held his head, "Then you have to ask yourself. I'm also very curious about this question." In fact, he woke up as soon as Shijir got up that night, but he kept silent and watched him sneak out and come back. The escort agency came early the next morning. This was something that could never be done without money. His eyes were firm and he could see that Shen Yu had nothing to hide. Xieting Zhou is not someone who is easy to fool, and ordinary excuses will definitely not fool him. Shen Yu thought about it for a moment. A simple lie could be easily exposed, but the least likely thing to be exposed was a lie that was both true and false. "I went out secretly that night." "Yeah, I know," Xieting Zhou said. Shen Yu couldn't help but be frightened. He was really holding his breath. He had been on the road with the escort for 3 days before he asked. He secretly rejoiced that he had not lied just now, otherwise Xieting Zhou would have exposed him immediately. She glanced at Xieting Zhou. He was leaning on the soft cushion, tapping his fingers on his bent knees, as if waiting for an answer. "After I went out, I went to a wealthy merchant in the city." Shen Yu paused, looking at his face, and then said, "I went to borrow some money." Xieting Zhou, "Borrow?" Shen Yu said, "I borrowed it secretly." Xieting Zhou let out a chuckle, "Stealing is stealing, and I borrowed it secretly." Shen Yu was dissatisfied, "Robbing the rich and giving to the poor, it just so happens that we are all impoverished now. Otherwise, where did this carriage come from? Where did the escort agency come from? Can you live comfortably here without money? Can your golden body bear it? Don't stare at people like that when you do bad things in the future," Xieting Zhou said. "You can't hide things with those eyes of yours." It seems that he has developed a habit recently. Whenever he doesn't tease Shijir, he always feels that there is something wrong with him. Shen Yu quickly looked away. It was indeed stolen, but it wasn't the palace that enjoyed it, wasn't it you? Then this money can be considered as what you owe. Xieting Zhou discovered that this person had a habit of kicking his nose and face. "I used to be respectful to him in the army, but after getting along with him during this time, I became more and more unruly." Xieting Zhou felt funny when he looked at him and asked, "Then how much did you steal, borrow?" Shen Yu almost burst into laughter and took out a stack of banknotes from her chest. Xieting Zhou took it and turned it over. The banknote was still warm. He nodded slightly and said, "It's quite a lot. I'm very good at borrowing." Shen Yu pursed her lips and said, "You'd better stop praising me." She reached out to take it, but Xieting Zhou raised her hand and refused to give it to him. "This is my money," Shen Yu said seriously. Xieting Zhou counted the banknote slowly and said casually, "Didn't you say that I owe it to you? Since I owe it, the principal should also fall into my hands. What do you think?" Shen Yu was finally convinced. "Since you are a natural eloquent, why bother here to embarrass others? Why don't you just talk?" Xie Zhou had enough of teasing and threw the banknote into his arms. He smiled and said, "Keep it. With such a big sum of money, be careful of someone murdering you." Shen Yu put the banknote in her arms and whispered, "Even if we die, we will die together. But don't worry, I will be your bodyguard on the way to hell." Xie Ting's smile remained unchanged, but the temperature in his eyes gradually cooled down. He remembered the woman lying on the ground and screaming at him. She said, "Xie Yun, you don't deserve a good death. People like you deserve to be alone all your life. After death, you will fall into the Abi hell and never be reincarnated." Xie Tingzhou looked at Shizhi quietly. If that person was still alive, he would definitely ask her to come and take a look. "Look, there is someone who wants to be my companion on the road to hell. Everything you said is wrong." Shen Yu didn't notice his expression, so she collected the banknotes, opened the curtain and got out of the carriage. The curtain was lowered and she turned back to stare at the carriage for a few moments. She breathed a sigh of relief, finally deceiving Xie Tingzhou. It was already dark, and a bonfire was burning not far away. Shen Yu sat down by the campfire, took a stick and dug it into the fire, thinking about it. After she secretly went out that night, she went to the shop owned by Lu in the city. In previous years, she was either at the border or at her grandmother's house in Hezhu, and had helped her manage the accounts for a period of time. She carried the Lu family seal on her body, and she could mention money to any of the Lu family's shops in the Great Zhou dynasty. But she couldn't let Xie Tingzhou know. Once her identity was exposed, whether she could continue to be with Xie Tingzhou was a big question. When Liu Yao and Hong Qiao left Yan Liangwen that day, Shen Yu had arranged errands for them. She wrote 2 letters respectively. Hong Qiao was responsible for going to Hezhu and delivering the letter to her grandmother, while Liu Yao returned to Beijing and handed another letter to Shen Yan, explaining to her the subsequent arrangements at home and her father. "How to manage the funeral of my brother. Now that she is delayed on the road, I don't know if they have managed to get things done. After all, my father's funeral should be over by now." For some reason, she always felt uneasy, as if something was twisting in a direction beyond her control. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the Concubine, Eliminating the Wife, Reborn, I Refuse to Marry the Scumbag and Marry the Prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 41. It's the end of the year, and Shengjing, thousands of miles away, is bustling and peaceful. Many wealthy families have begun to put up lanterns and streamers, and red lanterns have been hung under the eaves early. Zhang Lianzi looked at the person in the painting blankly, always feeling that they looked alike but not alike. Au seemed to be more energetic than the person in the painting, and the look in her eyes was brighter. Yes, he painted her as she was before. In this life, he knew her earlier and saw her differently. He picked up the pen and added a few strokes to the painting, stepped back and looked again, and sure enough, she looked even more similar to the one he saw at the back door of Shen's house that night. A smile appeared on his lips, and he put down the pen with satisfaction, staring blankly as he did a few days ago. Gao Jin, the young man, knocked on the door outside and said, "Master, Miss Shen is here." He listened to the door but didn't hear any movement inside, so he knocked again, "Master." In the study room, Zhang Lianzi, who had been looking at the paintings on the wall, finally moved. He turned his head and asked in a hoarse voice, "What's the matter?" Gao Jin said cautiously, "Miss Shen is here. Madam asked me to inform you." Zhang Lianzi was silent. "What is she here for?" "I said I came to apologize to the young master, and I brought some." Gao Jin paused. That name has now become a taboo for Zhang Lianzi. "She also brought some relics of Miss Shen." Zhang Lianzi clenched his hands into fists, trembling slightly, and released them after a moment, let her wait in the side hall. Shen Yan was dressed in plain clothes, with a white flower on her head. She frequently looked towards the door, and after a long time she heard the sound of footsteps. She stood up immediately, mingling the handkerchiefs in her hands. Seeing Zhang Lianzi crossing the threshold with his robe in hand, she bowed and said, "Master Zhang." Zhang Lianzi nodded and sat down. "Miss, why are you here late at night?" Shen Yan immediately turned red and refused to sit down. She said, "I came here specifically to apologize to you today. I know you blame me, but I had no choice but to lie to you that my sister was still at home. My sister ran to the border alone, and she is about to discuss marriage. If this matter is known to others, her reputation will be stained. I believe you also know how important reputation is to a woman." During those days, Zhang Lianzi would come to the house every day or three to deliver gifts, which were all small things from his daughter's house. After waiting for more than a month, until the border war report came, he knew that Shen Yu must be heartbroken at this moment. He was afraid that she would cry, so he didn't care about etiquette at all, he just wanted to see if she was okay. It wasn't until she found out that she wasn't at home at all that Shen Yan told him everything, saying that Shen Yu had gone to the border a long time ago, and it was Shen Yan who accepted his things these days. He personally went to the front line to find someone, but before they arrived at Yanliang Pass, another news came from the Shen family. General Shen's body was escorted back to Beijing, and Shen Yu's body came back with him. When he came back, the body was already enshrined. Zhang Lianzi's expression remained unchanged. "Miss Shen, please sit down. There is no need to say more about this matter. I have not blamed you for this. If you don't blame her for this, then it's something else." Shen Yan choked up and said, "She is my sister. She has been loved by her since I can remember. She never hesitates to give me whatever she has. I am the person in the world who hopes she can live the most." There was silence in the side hall. After a long time, Zhang Lianzi finally spoke. "Did she leave any words before she left?" "No," Shen Yan shook her head, "she left secretly, and no one in our house knew about it." Zhang Lianzi looked at her expression, as if he wanted to find some clues from it. But no, Shen Yan stared at him, her eyes not evading at all, and the sadness on her face could not be faked. Shen Yan turned her head, wiped the corners of her eyes with a handkerchief, and said, "I haven't touched anything that your excellency gave to sister. Except for the broken pastries, I brought everything else over. I know your thoughts about sister, so today I brought some of my sister's belongings as a thought to you. I heard from Mrs. Zhang that you haven't thought about food or tea recently. If my sister knew about this, she would definitely not want you to be like this." Zhang Lianzi blinked his eyelashes slightly and suddenly smiled. He murmured, "She won't care about me. She probably hates me to death." Shen Yan didn't hear clearly. "What did your excellency say?" "Nothing." Zhang Lianzi looked at her. "Where are her things?" Shen Yan tilted her head, and the maid behind her presented an exquisite box. Zhang Lianzi opened it and found several things in the box, including a hairpin, a wooden comb, and a small wooden sword. He picked up the wooden sword and asked, "What is this?" "It was a wooden sword that my elder sister made for her after she was pestered by her elder brother when she was little. She liked it very much, and later she stopped playing with it and never wanted to throw it away." Shen Yan choked up again as she spoke. "I originally wanted to keep it for myself, but my sister in the general's mansion has been everywhere, and her shadow is everywhere. I think you need it more than me." Zhang Lianzi lowered his eyes and stroked the wooden sword, and said, "Thank you, Miss Shen Er." Shen Yan stood up and said goodbye. "Then I'll leave first, sir, take care." Zhang Lianzi nodded. "Gao Jin, go give me a gift." "Miss Shen Er, please come this way." Gao Jin saw Shen Yan out. Zhang Lianzi put back the wooden sword, picked up the box, looked at the sky when he stepped out of the threshold, and casually asked the boy at the door, "Why did Miss Shen come so late?" Mrs. Zhang, who came to comfort him, happened to hear this and said, "Why else? 3 Shen family members were killed in one battle. It sounds like they are full of loyal people, but in the end, they have no heirs. Only a stepwife and a young lady are left. They collapsed. Everyone wants to step on it. I don't know, some heartless person who spread the rumor that Mrs. Shen didn't like the children of her first wife, so she sent Miss Shen to die too. Now that they are being criticized when they go out, their life is very difficult. They can only go out when there are fewer black people." Zhang Lianzi went to the study in silence. Mrs. Zhang hasn't seen Zhang Lianzi in a few days. His temper has become more and more unpredictable recently. She usually doesn't dare to disturb him in his courtyard, but today she finally found an opportunity. Lianzi Mrs. Zhang followed. After receiving the news of Miss Shen's death, Zhang Linzi became angry for quite a while. Later, he stopped thinking about food and drinks. He lost weight and his temper became more sinister. Now everyone in the house treats him with caution. Now that Miss Shen has passed away, the dead cannot be resurrected. There is no way to delay your marriage like this. Now I will not force you to look at each other anxiously. I have watched Qiun in my courtyard grow up. You know her well. She has a good temper and can take care of others. I want to give you a wife first and then make her a concubine after you marry her. What do you think?" Qiun's face was full of shyness, and she secretly peeked at Zhang Lianzi. Zhang Lianzi didn't even look at her. The veins on his neck were bulging, but he still remembered that filial piety comes first, and he suppressed his anger. The courtyard gate was right in front of him. He quickened his pace. After entering the courtyard, he turned around and said, "Mother, it's late at night. My son will go to pay his respects to his mother another day." Mrs. Zhang watched the courtyard door close in front of her and turned to ask Qiun, "Did I say something wrong?" He looked very angry. Qiun said, "The young master probably hasn't gotten over his grief yet. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi." Chapter 42. Zhang Lianzi closed the study door and leaned against the door to take a deep breath. She had just died, and these people persuaded him to take concubines and marry wives, just like in his previous life. Taking a concubine? How could he? Auntie would definitely be angry, Zhang Lianzi thought. In the previous life, it was because he wanted to take a concubine, and she, who never refuted, said no to him for the first time. It's a pity that he didn't agree to her at that time, but instead told her not to be unreasonable. He didn't expect that the side of the study would become a farewell forever. Thinking of this, Zhang Lianzi's heart ached. How could she die? How could she die like that? She obviously didn't go to the border in her last life, so what went wrong? When he relives his life, he just wants to make up for the regrets of his previous life. He will definitely be twice as kind to her and will never take a concubine again. She will be the only one in this life. But how could she, how dare she abandon herself like this? Zhang Lianzi's breathing was rapid and he slowly walked to the desk. With a clang, he swung the things on the desk to the ground. The boy outside the door flinched a few times, followed by several loud noises in the room. The house was smashed into a mess. Zhang Lianzi stood among the ruins and gasped. She can't die. He didn't believe she died like this. Gao Jin, Zhang Lianzi opened the door and shouted. As soon as Gao Jin entered the courtyard, he heard Zhang Lianzi calling him and hurriedly ran over, "Your Majesty's orders." Zhang Lianzi whispered, "Go and check." Gao Jin listened, nodded, took note, and went to work overnight. The further south we go, the less snow there is. After another day of hurrying and slowing, the escort team finally arrived in Yian in front of Guancheng Gate. Yian is a big city, located in the center of Lingzhou,
connected with Dingzhou, and you can go directly to Shengjing through Dingzhou. Shen Yu had been here before and had seen the prosperity of the soft red city. It was already 3 o'clock in the afternoon when they entered the city, and there were still an endless stream of pedestrians on the street. Boats on the river were connected one after another, with laughter and music, and it was very lively. Shen Yu lifted the curtain and looked around, then turned around and asked, "How does this place compare with yours in the north?" Xie Zhou glanced at it casually, slightly inferior. Shen Yu asked, "Where is the inferiority?" Xie Zhou stroked his sleeves, looked at the woman on the painted boat waving silk gently, and said lightly, "It's not as beautiful as Balin." "Dog man." Shen Yu made a sound and threw the curtain out. Xie Zhou smiled. The carriage stopped in front of an inn. When the waiter saw Nyoda and a group of people, he knew that business was coming and hurriedly stepped forward to greet the guests. Shen Yu got out of the car first, looked up at the sign, turned around and extended her hand. Xie Zhou was about to get out of the car when he lowered his eyes and saw an arm across his face. The shaft of the carriage is only 2 feet high. Does he really think that he is weak and cannot take care of himself? Shen Yu waited for a long time before she saw Xie Zhou slowly put his hand on her arm and got out of the carriage. The money she has on her is more than enough to buy the best inn in the city, but if her wealth is not revealed, no one can guarantee that the people in the escort agency will not have evil intentions in front of the money. This trip to Beijing can take 5 days quickly or 10 days slowly, so it is better to be safe. The people from the escort agency only arranged a room for the 2 of them, but they were used to living together all the way, so they didn't think there was anything wrong. Shen Yu huddled in the carriage for many days, until her bones ached all over her body. She climbed into the bed and fell asleep on her side. Xie Zhou blew out the lamp and sat in the darkness, uncharacteristically not going to bed. The clapper rang 4 times, 1 slowly, 3 quickly, and several short bird calls suddenly came from the wind. Xie Zhou walked to the bed. The person on the bed was sleeping soundly and had rolled from the inside of the bed to the center. He was so familiar that within an hour, this person could occupy the entire bed. The window opened and closed, and a dark figure disappeared from the window in the blink of an eye. A huge goshawk flew through the air and flew towards a residential house. His robes flew as he jumped. Xie Zhou tiptoed, and landed quietly in a courtyard. The snow-white goshawk in the sky swooped down, its wings folded and landed on the eaves. It was the most precious jade claw among the gods of eagles, Hai Dongqing. "Your Highness." Xie Zhou lowered his eyes slightly. "How is the situation?" Zifeng said sternly, "Your Highness is indeed right. There were hundreds of dead soldiers among the bandits that day. We captured a few alive, but they hid poison in their teeth and failed to survive. Please punish them." Xie Zhou raised his hands slightly, and Hai Dongqing fluttered his wings and landed on his arm. "Hundreds of dead soldiers, they are really willing to spend their money. It seems that they have been forced to a dead end and want to fight to the death." "Exactly," Zifeng said solemnly. "The falling rocks crushed the double in the prison car to pieces. They thought Liang Jianfang was dead, but they were not sure whether His Highness had obtained Liang Jianfang's confession. So since His Highness disappeared, there are several groups of people are searching for His Highness' whereabouts. Finally, we caught people out." Xie Zhou touched Hai Dongqing and said softly, "Then it's not in vain that I set up a trap and put myself in to play with them." The drama that was originally planned turned out to be a fake one when Shijer showed up halfway. 11 Feng said, "Now that the man has been fished out, I will escort His Highness back to the capital." Xie Zhou suddenly fell silent. He turned his head and looked in one direction for a few seconds and said, "There's no hurry." 11 Feng didn't dare to ask why. His Highness had his own arrangements, so he only said, "You escorted His Highness all the way on this trip, can you still do your best?" Xie Zhou chuckled, "He is very courageous." Xia was assigned to 11 Feng by Xie Zhou. Xieting's whose bodyguard was commanded by 11 Feng. If his subordinates failed to protect their master, 11 Feng should be punished together. 11 Feng lowered his head and said in a harsh voice, "It's because my subordinates didn't discipline me well. You can't control him." Zai Feng failed to understand the meaning of these words, and Xieting Zhou had changed the topic. "How is Jing Zhong doing now?" "Everything is fine," 11 Feng reported one by one. Liang Jianfang has been secretly imprisoned in the dungeon of the palace without anyone noticing. Chang Lu and Kang Ye have settled in the palace in Shengjing. Xieting Zhou nodded slightly and explained some things to Zai Feng. After everything was done, he patted Hai Dongqing's head twice and whispered, "Don't follow too closely." Then he raised his arms and Hai Dongqing flapped his wings and flew out. Xieting Zhou returned the same way and just closed the window when he turned around and saw a figure sitting on the bed. Shen Yu just woke up, rubbed her eyes and said confusedly, "Where did you go in the middle of the night? Why didn't you take me with you?" She had just woken up, her voice was a little hoarse, and a little soft without warning. Xieting Zhou suddenly had the illusion that his husband had gone out to have sex in the middle of the night and was caught by his wife when he came back. Xieting Zhou said nothing, walked straight to the table, poured a cup of tea and drank it in one gulp, and then asked, "Why are I taking you?" "I'm protecting you." Shen Yu woke up a little and stared at him for a long time, then suddenly said, "Oh, I understand." After that, he fell back to sleep. Xieting Zhou put down his teacup, turned his head and asked, "What do you understand?" Shen Yu leaned further on the bed, closed her eyes and said, "If you see through it, don't tell it. I have to save some face for you." Xieting Zhou smiled, sat on the bed and leaned forward to look at him. "You don't have to save face for me, but tell me, what do you understand?" Shen Yu opened her eyes, "Do you really want me to say it?" "Say." Xieting Zhou lowered his eyes and looked at him, showing no anger or authority.